let's say that you're taking a college-level history survey course on the history of the United States, from the arrival of Europeans to the Americas through the American Civil War. You've passed the midterm and are in the second half of the semester, when typically it's time to start focusing on a larger research or term paper. Your professor gives you the following essay prompt. Write an analytical essay explaining how the process of westward expansion shaped the history of the United States. You're like, what? And your head explodes. Immediately you think to yourself, how am I supposed to explain that in one short paper? You know from your study of American history so far that westward expansion had tremendous influence on everything about the United States, its economics, politics, society, and culture, and that there were racial, class, and gender dynamics involved, that you could write about everything from military battles to religious movements, to say nothing of the enormous and devastating impact that westward expansion had on the indigenous nations already living there. So you're hyperventilating and you're biting your nails and procrastinating because the assignment seems so overwhelming. Well, in these situations, a good rule of thumb is to break the task down into smaller, more manageable bites. So let's start by doing that. First, from your experience in the class so far, you understand that the quality of an analytical essay depends on how well you develop three main areas of the paper: the argument, or the thesis, the structure of your paper, or its organization, and the evidence in your paper, or the support you give for your argument. Okay, good. Now you have an agenda to work through. Then you immediately hit a problem. Since you know that the thesis is the single most important element of any piece of history writing, it is natural to begin there. You also know that your argument must be clear and specific, that the thesis must answer a key question, and that it must appear in the introduction as the thesis statement. So you look at the prompt and you ask yourself, what is my thesis? Sweat forms on your forehead. You start breaking out into hives. You fight to keep yourself from running out of the room screaming. The thesis is not only the most important element in your paper, it's also easily the hardest thing in academia to create. This is so because the thesis needs to explain in one clear statement what your entire paper is about. And the paradox you find yourself in is this: how are you supposed to know what your entire paper is about when you haven't written it yet? So instead of struggling to nail down your argument right away and definitively right at the beginning, begin instead with a working thesis, or a hypothesis, if you will. Or better yet, remind yourself that the thesis is always the answer to a question. If the prompt does not give you a straight question to answer in your paper, as in the case of our example, start by coming up with your own, more precise and direct question. There is a lot of room in this particular prompt for creative questioning. You think again about all the ways that you could approach the process of westward expansion, and decide that you're particularly interested in how Americans came into contact and interacted with other nations as a result of westward expansion. So you flip that idea into a research question. How did the process of westward expansion shape the foreign relations of the United States? Now, as you can see from this is much more specific than the very broad essay prompt, just explaining the impact of westward expansion on the history of the United States. Now you're asking, how did the process specifically shape the foreign relations of the United States? Right now, you don't have a thesis, but you've taken a solid step and identified your basic question. And at this point, you could begin the process of analyzing and assembling your sources. Or you might come up with a working thesis, an answer to the question that you just posed, or a hypothesis. For example, you might hypothesize that westward expansion turned the United States into a more militant country because it led to continual conflicts with other nations. Maybe. You don't know. You'll find that out when you do your research. So this is just a working hypothesis. Either way, whether you start with a question or you have a working thesis to work with, it's very important to realize that your thesis or your argument should always remain flexible until it is time to finish the paper and turn it in. Be willing and ready to adjust your thesis at any point during the process of research and writing. You should return to your thesis again and again to make it sharper, clearer, and more specific. At minimum, go back at the very end of the paper writing process and revise the argument if necessary. It is very difficult to get your argument completely nailed down before you've written the actual paper. And in fact, I wouldn't advise you to do that because you need to remain flexible enough to change your argument as you uncover new evidence. So what comes next? Well, start doing the research. It's time to dive into the primary and secondary sources, searching for the answers to your historical question. Keep your key question or your working thesis front and center in your mind as you analyze the sources. In fact, it would help you to literally keep the question in front of your face at the top of your notes to remind yourself at every point what it is you're after. The research process could take quite a bit of time. No matter what topic you pick, there's a massive amount of information out there to explore. Human beings love to record their thoughts. People long dead have left behind troves of primary sources, and historians will never stop writing endlessly about the same subjects from different angles. The deeper you go into the sources, the more you'll uncover, and you'll need to balance the extent of your research with the time that you actually have available. This research process, including tips for how to maximize your time, will be covered in a separate video called Conducting Research. So anyway, let's fast forward. You've taken piles of notes from your reading and primary and secondary sources. So many, in fact, that now you're worried that you have too much information. How are you going to pull all this together in time? Why does studying the past have to induce panic attacks? Well, don't worry. You're doing exactly what needs to be done, and in just the right order. Move now to the second main area of analytical writing. Structure. That is just what you need now to bring some organization to your crazy stack of notes, your highlighted documents, and all your dog-eared books. When beginning to organize your paper, there's a good question to ask yourself. What does the reader need to know, and in what specific order, to be persuaded by my argument? Go now back to your research question or your working hypothesis. How did the process of westward expansion shape the foreign relations of the United States? Or, westward expansion turned the United States into a more militant country because it led to continual conflicts with other nations. Now you're looking at your thesis and you're thinking about organizing all your evidence, and you have a sudden insight. During your research to answer the question about foreign relations, you became fascinated by the concept of manifest destiny. The idea, articulated by Americans in the 19th century, that the United States was destined by God to overtake and expand across the North American continent. You found that this emotional, quasi-religious belief put a distinctly American twist on the process of westward expansion, with direct implications for relations with Native Americans, with Mexico, and with the countries of Europe. Now all of a sudden you don't really like your working thesis anymore because it seems too vague, so you modify it. Originally, you had westward expansion turn the United States into a more militant country because it led to continual conflicts with other nations. Now you modify your thesis. Through the process of westward expansion, Americans came to believe in manifest destiny, which led to more aggressive foreign relations with Native Americans, Mexico, and Europe. You see how this moved from kind of vague and broad to more specific. You have a focus now just not on foreign policy, but on a specific historical idea called manifest destiny. And you've specified some of the actual areas of the world that the United States is coming into contact with. You also realize that you've stopped biting your nails. Now go back to work on the structure. You could, of course, just start writing and see what happens, and this is always a good strategy to get warmed up when you're feeling writer's block. But it is practically guaranteed that an essay will be stronger, clearer, and easier to follow if you put a little preparation to it. And that means an outline. Now, outlining can feel like a chore, but it's an important core element of critical analysis. Think of your outline as building support beams of a building or a human skeleton. It gives the paper its internal strength. It provides the foundation to hold up the concrete or the muscles of your sources. In constructing your outline, go back to the main question about paper structure. What does the reader need to know, and in what specific order to be persuaded by my argument? Well, you know right away that what you need to start your paper with, an introduction. And you know that your introduction will carry your thesis. So put that down first in your outline. Then what comes next? If your paper will be long enough, it's always a good idea to start with a paragraph or two in which you provide historical background and context necessary for the reader to understand the specific scope and details of your argument. In this case, you'll want to spend some time elaborating on the theme of westward expansion in U.S. history, so make that the next section of your paper. Now that your argument is going to zero in specifically on manifest destiny, you'll probably want a section analyzing that concept. So put down that next. After explaining manifest destiny, you start to see from your thesis that the blueprint of your paper is emerging. From there, you'll want to maybe go into the impact of manifest destiny on relations with Native Americans, then the impact of manifest destiny on relations with Mexico, then the impact of manifest destiny on relations with Europe, and then finally a conclusion. Now, each one of these sections that you've written can be as long or short as the sources will allow, one paragraph, several paragraphs, so you realize there's no need for a long, wild outline with dozens of headings and subheadings. Keep your outline simple. One more section for a conclusion, and you've got your paper mapped out. Now, with your working thesis and your outline before you, you really are ready to start writing the paper. Maintain the clarity and solidity of structure from the outline to the paper itself. Build your paper with distinct paragraphs, starting with the intro paragraph. Each paragraph advancing its own point, but connected to the previous paragraph, all of which are furthering the development of your main argument. How do you do that? Well, here are some keys to good essay structure. Begin every paragraph with a topic sentence. A topic sentence is the main point of that paragraph. It's like a mini thesis in support of the larger argument. Once you have your outline, the topic sentences should emerge from that. Let's take the example that we've been following and convert our outline headings into topic sentences. So you start with the intro. The theme of the intro is, of course, the thesis. Through the process of westward expansion, Americans came to believe in manifest destiny, which led to more aggressive foreign relations with Native Americans, Mexico, and Europe. Move on to your next paragraph, the background and context. You might have a topic sentence that begins the paragraph something like this. The formation of the United States was always an expansionist process that brought Americans into contact with other nations. So this is setting the large context of the whole concept of westward expansion and its relationship to foreign relations. There's enough here that needs to be explained that maybe you have another paragraph with background and context. This one might get more specific in time. This process accelerated dramatically in the early 19th century due to the transportation and commercial advancements known as the market revolution. So you've started broadly with westward expansion, now you've zoomed into the 19th century and the period following the market revolution. From there you move on to the central theme, manifest destiny. The introduction to that paragraph might read, the powerful combination of economic interest, land fever, and sense of divine right came together in an approach to foreign relations called manifest destiny. Now you're moving on to the show manifest destiny in action. U.S. and Native Americans. With the articulation of manifest destiny, Americans were able to justify the dispossession of the territories of indigenous inhabitants, most notably Native American nations. Next, foreign policy driven by manifest destiny was at its most aggressive in the Mexican-American War, through which the United States acquired an enormous piece of territory from Mexico. But manifest destiny was not confined to relations with indigenous or neighboring powers. It also influenced relations with the nations of Europe. As you can see, each one of these topic sentences is its own little argument, but each one also connects the paragraph to the one that it followed, and all of them, like a little but strong chain, are anchored to the main argument, your thesis. How you actually do this will all depend on your writing style. You might find it useful to write out all your topic sentences just like this, or develop them as you go along in the process of writing. The point to stress here is that topic sentences make it easier not only for the reader to follow, but also for you as the author to write. So now you're all set up. You've got a thesis that drives your paper like a heart or a brain. You've got a skeleton in the form of your outline, and you've begun building the essay's muscles with strong and direct topic sentences. Now comes the final major step of packing on all the flesh and blood, your analysis and your evidence. Without analysis, this isn't an academic paper. Without evidence, all of your hard work is for nothing. A history paper without evidence is simply not a piece of historical analysis. It's just your opinion. With your outline and your topic sentences, though, the process of supporting your argument should be easier. Many people start with writing the introduction, and you may have already done that in the early in your process. If you do, return to the introduction. Like the thesis, and make sure that it really reflects your actual paper. Be specific in your intro. Explain your topic, scope, and argument, but avoid generalizations. One common mistake people make is to open their papers with global statements like all throughout history or from the beginning of time. These are no good for 3 reasons. First, you simply cannot prove them. How could you possibly know what's been going on from the beginning of time or all throughout history, and how could you put that in one little paper? And second, these statements are so broad that they're basically meaningless. Third, they're so vague that they give you no sense at all of what this paper is about. Instead, just be direct. Get right to it. In the early 19th century, the United States began rapidly and aggressively expanding westward. Perfect way to just open up the paper. It tells you exactly and immediately what the paper's main topic is. It gives you the geographical location and the time frame. Then spend the rest of the introduction providing concise but key information, including, of course, the thesis statement that helps your reader understand exactly what your argument is. Move then to your body paragraphs, keeping your thesis always in mind, and begin developing and supporting each of your topic sentences. Limit your evidence and analysis in each paragraph to proving the paragraph's key point. And if you find yourself drifting into another distinct point, consider turning that into its own paragraph. Follow your outline, but you can be a little flexible. You may discover that a section you plan to be 1 paragraph really should be 2. Or you may discover that you can eliminate an entire section because it no longer works for your argument. Now, here are some tips for your writing. In history papers, especially short ones, pretty much every paragraph needs cited references. It is the rare paragraph, typically only the introduction and conclusion, in which everything that you write is straight from your own head. This is very important. You must cite the sources for any words or ideas that you got from somewhere outside of your own imagination. For example, in the paper that we've been using as a sample, it is probable that the first 2 paragraphs on the background and context of westward expansion would include a lot of information that you found in secondary sources. Even if you don't quote them directly, those sources, but instead summarize and paraphrase them, you still need to give those books credit. If most of the information in your paragraph came from one source, cite that source at the end of the paragraph. Speaking of quotes and paraphrasing, try to develop a healthy balance between the two. A paragraph dominated by long or frequent direct quotes from both primary and secondary sources is not very strong because you're over-relying on the sources to make your arguments instead of making them yourself. Paraphrasing is effective because it shows that you digested the evidence and can explain it in your own words. On the other hand, careful and pointed use of quotes is an extremely effective way to bring the reader into direct contact with the sources. The key is to find balance. One of the strongest stylistic skills to develop is integrating key pieces from quotes into your own sentences. Ideally, you'll want your paper to express your voice. You're using evidence to support your argument. You are the expert, so be authoritative. Make the reader understand that you know what you're talking about because you've immersed yourself in the research. After you've drafted the entire paper, written your conclusion, and if possible, rewrite your introduction. It is almost inevitable that in writing, you have realizations and discover ideas through the very process of writing itself. If you do, go back and retool the introduction and the thesis to account for those new discoveries. In our sample case, let's say you finish the paper and realize that you can make your thesis match your analysis even more precisely. What you have is very good Through the process of westward expansion, Americans came to believe in manifest destiny, which led to more aggressive foreign relations with Native Americans, Mexico, and Europe. But you want to tweak it. Instead of what you've written right here, you rewrite it and have a final thesis. During the 19th century, Americans embraced the idea of manifest destiny, which gave economic and geographical expansion a religious impetus that justified aggressive foreign relations with Native Americans, Mexico, and Europe. Now you think you've captured the full scope of what you've actually written in the paper. You're happy, you can put this thing together, and everything at this point is all about the time you have left for proofreading. Proofreading, editing, and making stylistic adjustments. Of course, your time is precious, and learning to finish assignments right at the deadline is part of the whole experience at college, but you'd be amazed at how much a quick run-through of your paper for typos, for weird or confusing sentences, straight-up errors, can improve the strength of your analysis. And that, of course, will lead you to score big time.